I am Yeshua ben Emma, 69 years old, and I have served as a rabbi for over 45 years. Never in my life did I believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Over the decades, I debated this point with thousands of people, defending my Jewish faith and identity. However, an event on November 11th, 2023, a near-death experience following a car accident transformed my life entirely. Let me introduce myself. I come from a deeply rooted Jewish family, descendants of the Levites, the ancient lineage entrusted with the sacred duty of serving in the temple. From a young age, I felt the weight of this responsibility, a calling that resonated deeply within me. My upbringing was shaped by the values of this heritage, and my household was one that honored and upheld these traditions with reverence and respect. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. Everything in my life, every lesson, every ritual, every belief was centered around this identity. Faith, heritage, and purpose were not just abstract concepts to me. They were the very foundation of who I was. I was taught from an early age that our family's role in the service of God was sacred, and I carried that responsibility with pride, knowing that it was my duty to honor and pass on these values. Growing up, I knew that my life was meant to be a reflection of this deep-rooted tradition, a life that was dedicated to the service of God and to maintaining the sanctity of our faith. This sense of purpose permeated every aspect of my life, and it was through this lens that I viewed the world and my place in it. After completing my yeshiva education, I felt a profound sense of duty and devotion to my faith, which led me to make a significant decision to travel to Israel, the land that held the heart of our Jewish heritage. It was there, in the land of our ancestors, that I would spend many years of my life. It was in Israel that my connection to the Jewish people, to our history, and to the very essence of my faith deepened. It was also in Jerusalem, the holiest city in the world for Jews, where my son was born, and his arrival in this sacred place further strengthened my commitment to the Jewish faith and to our future. Those years in Israel solidified my Jewish identity in a way that nothing else could. They became the foundation upon which my life was built. During this time, my understanding of Judaism evolved, and I felt an even greater sense of purpose in my life. Living in Israel allowed me to experience the daily rhythms of Jewish life prayers at the Western Wall, observing the Sabbath, celebrating the festivals, and immersing myself in the land that had been the cradle of our people for thousands of years. It was here, in the very heart of our tradition, that I began to truly appreciate the significance of my faith. My devotion to Judaism grew even stronger, and I became more deeply entrenched in the beliefs and practices that had defined my life. The anticipation of the coming of the Messiah, a figure I had been taught about since childhood, was something I believed with all my heart. I lived in a constant state of yearning for that day when the Messiah would come to fulfill the promises made to our people, when peace would be restored, and when the Jewish people would finally be redeemed. It was a belief that kept me grounded, a guiding light that influenced every decision I made, every prayer I offered, and every action I took. For me, Judaism was never just a tradition, it was the very core of who I was. It wasn't something I practiced because it was expected of me. It was something that resonated deeply within my soul. Every aspect of my life, my values, my principles, my sense of purpose was shaped by my devotion to God and the teachings of the Torah. I saw the Torah not just as a collection of ancient texts, but as a living, breathing guide that shaped every moment of my existence. It was the roadmap that taught me how to live a righteous life, how to treat others with kindness and respect, and how to honor God with every action I took. I spent my entire life striving to live in a way that reflected my deep devotion to God and the teachings of the Torah. Every decision I made, from the way I conducted myself in my personal life to how I taught my children, was influenced by the desire to live according to God's will. I didn't just follow the commandments out of obligation. I did so because I believed that by doing so, I was fulfilling the divine purpose that had been set before me. My devotion to Judaism wasn't something that I wore like an outward identity. It was something that ran so deeply through my veins that it became inseparable from who I was as a person. As I lived in Israel and raised my family, I continued to live with this conviction, always anticipating the coming of the Messiah. It was a belief that shaped my entire outlook on life. I didn't simply wait for the Messiah to appear. I lived as though I were preparing for his arrival each and every day. My hope for redemption, for peace, for the restoration of our people, kept me moving forward in faith. Every prayer I offered, every moment of reflection, was an offering in anticipation of that great day when the promises of the prophets would be fulfilled. However, on November 11th, 2023, an event occurred that would challenge the very foundations of my faith and illuminate a new, unexpected path for me, one that would forever change the course of my life. That day began like any other. It was a cold, crisp morning, and I had just finished my work and was on my way home. A short drive of just a few kilometers. The sky was gray, and the roads were slick with the remnants of a light snowfall. Everything seemed ordinary, mundane even, the kind of day that should have ended peacefully in the comfort of home. But in an instant, everything changed. Suddenly, the car in front of me braked unexpectedly. I reacted instinctively, trying to avoid a collision, but the icy road was unforgiving. The tires slid, and despite my efforts to regain control, I lost it. In that split second, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. I felt the vehicle swerving, the world around me spinning, and then there was a violent impact. The sound of metal crashing into metal, the shudder of my body, and then deafening silence. Everything went dark. The light around me dimmed as if the world itself had shut off, and I was left suspended in a void, disconnected from reality. It felt as though time itself had stopped, leaving me in a state of stillness that was both terrifying and oddly peaceful. I could feel nothing at first, no pain, no fear, just darkness. When I regained awareness, I found myself in a completely unfamiliar place. At first, I thought I was dreaming, as the sensation of being somewhere other than where I had been felt too surreal to be real. But soon, I realized that this was no dream. The reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy fog. The air was thick, oppressive, and suffocating, making it difficult to breathe, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. There was no light, only an overwhelming darkness that surrounded me from all sides. This darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was something much deeper, much more oppressive. It felt tangible, like a force that wrapped itself around me, blocking every path and every escape. I could feel it closing in on me, a palpable presence that weighed on my spirit. The darkness wasn't cold, it was warm, stifling, and filled with an unbearable sense of despair and regret. The weight of past choices, unspoken words, and unresolved feelings seemed to hang in the air, suffocating me. It was as though the very space I was in had absorbed all the sorrow and guilt of my life, and now it surrounded me in a way that I couldn't escape. It was a darkness that wasn't just external. It reached deep into my soul, bringing every regret, every doubt, every fear to the surface. The overwhelming sense of failure, of being trapped in the consequences of my life, was almost too much to bear. I couldn't immediately understand where I was. My body felt disconnected from reality, as if I were floating in a strange limbo, unable to anchor myself to anything familiar. A deep confusion consumed me, and I struggled to make sense of my surroundings. The silence around me was overwhelming, an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my ears, making it hard to think, to breathe. It was a silence that felt alive, suffocating in its intensity. But soon, the silence shattered. I began to hear wails, heartbreaking cries that pierced the air, carrying with them a depth of anguish I had never known. Alongside the cries, whispers filled the space, each one laced with anger, sorrow, and suffering. The voices were so full of pain, so raw, that they seemed to tear through the darkness, echoing endlessly. Each cry carried with it the weight of eternal torment, a deep, unrelenting suffering that could never be alleviated. As I listened to these voices, a cold, dreadful realization hit me like a storm. This was no ordinary place. This wasn't a dream or a figment of my imagination. No, this was a place of suffering, a reality of anguish beyond anything I had ever encountered or even imagined. It was a place where the torment was eternal, where regret, pain, and despair were woven into the very fabric of existence. It was a place that no religious text, no warning, could ever fully describe. It was far beyond the descriptions of hell I had heard in the past. This was a place of absolute and unrelenting suffering, a place where nothing and no one could escape the consequences of their actions. And it was here, in this place, that I now found myself, as I began to fall slowly, steadily, into what felt like an endless abyss. I saw shapes and forms materializing from the darkness. At first, they were blurry, indistinct shadows that seemed to shift and move. But as I descended further, they grew clearer, and what I saw was more horrifying than anything I had ever imagined. Massive, grotesque figures began to emerge from the depths of the void, their shapes distorted and unnatural. These figures seemed to blend seamlessly into the very walls of the cavern I was falling into, as though they were part of the very fabric of the place. But as I looked closer, the horrifying truth became clear. The walls weren't made of stone, as I had first assumed. No, they were made of flesh, flesh that twisted and pulsed as though alive. The walls were alive, beating, breathing, and throbbing with an energy that was both nauseating and terrifying. Faces were trapped within these walls of flesh, their features contorted in expressions of eternal agony. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror, but their mouths were frozen in silent screams. The faces were impossibly distorted, as though the very essence of their suffering had been etched into their flesh. Unable to escape, the faces seemed to stare directly at me as I descended, their silent screams echoing in my mind, amplifying the horror of what I was witnessing. Each face was a prisoner, caught in a never-ending torment, their cries of pain silenced by the very walls that held them captive. The realization hit me with brutal force. This place was a prison, a place where suffering was eternal and unrelenting. The torment I saw was not just physical, it was spiritual, a suffering that went beyond the body and into the soul. It was a suffering that could never be alleviated, a pain that could never be undone. An invisible force seemed to pull me deeper, dragging me relentlessly into a void that wasn't empty, but instead was filled with an overwhelming weight of boundless anger, suffering, and remorse. The darkness around me was thick with it, and it seemed to press against me from all sides. Every scream, every moan, every cry of despair reverberated through the air, piercing my very being. Each sound was a blade, slicing through me, filling me with the anguish of those who were trapped in this place. The more I tried to resist, the deeper I was pulled, as though the very fabric of this reality was drawing me in, consuming me. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the physical sensation of being dragged deeper, it was the suffocating weight of the suffering that seemed to seep into every part of my soul. The anger and regret around me were not just distant echoes, they were alive, coursing through me, feeding on my fear and confusion. The faces in the walls, the endless wails, the cries for help, they all seemed to converge on me, making me feel as though I was becoming part of the very suffering that surrounded me. It felt as though my own pain, my own regrets, were being magnified, amplified by the unbearable weight of everything I was witnessing. I was no longer an observer. I was becoming one with the torment, and the deeper I fell, the more I understood that this suffering was endless. There was no escape. Among the tortured faces, I saw ones I recognized, respected rabbis and teachers who had once guided my spiritual growth. These were men I had looked up to, revered, and trusted as spiritual authorities. They had shaped my understanding of God, the Torah, and the sacred traditions of our people. To see them in such a state, trapped in eternal torment, was both shocking and devastating. Their faces, once so full of wisdom and reverence, were now twisted in agony, their eyes filled with hopelessness and suffering. It was as though everything I had believed in had been upended, shattered by the very sight of these men who had once represented the pinnacle of righteousness, now bound in this unimaginable place of despair. The sight of their torment in this place hit me with a brutal force. If these were the men I had revered, the men I had believed to be the epitome of faith and righteousness, what hope was there for me? The question echoed in my mind, a haunting realization that shook me to my core. If they, who had dedicated their lives to serving God and guiding others, had ended up here, what chance did I have? What hope could I hold on to in a place so far removed from the light of truth and salvation? The weight of this realization pressed down on me, and I felt as though I were being crushed under the enormity of the suffering that surrounded me. It was a terrifying thought, and I struggled to hold on to the faith that had once been my foundation. When my descent finally stopped, I could feel the gravity of my surroundings settle in with terrifying clarity. I stood in a vast, nightmarish landscape of fiery valleys, each one stretching endlessly before me. The flames twisted and roared, not like ordinary fire, but like living entities, their movements purposeful and alive with an energy of their own. They were wild, uncontrollable, hungry, crackling, and twisting with a ferocity that felt almost sentient. The fire didn't just burn. It seemed to pulse with a dark life of its own, an unstoppable force that fed on something deeper than mere fuel. The heat was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical. It felt as though it was burning me from the inside out, searing my very soul. The intensity of the flames was spiritual as much as it was bodily. Every part of me seemed to be consumed by the heat, by the suffering that radiated from this place. It was as though the fire wasn't just burning my skin but was penetrating deeper, reaching into the very core of my being, igniting every regret, every fear, every mistake I had ever made. It was a fire that didn't just scorch, it purged, painfully and relentlessly, as though it was trying to consume everything I was, reducing me to nothing. The landscape around me was devoid of mercy. The fiery valleys stretched in all directions, and no matter how far I looked, I could see no escape, no end to the torment. Every inch of the ground seemed to pulse with heat. Every corner seemed to harbor another form of suffering. The flames roared in my ears, drowning out everything else, drowning out my thoughts, my cries. It was a place where every inch was consumed by torment, a place where nothing could exist without pain, without the searing touch of fire and anguish. And in the heart of it, I realized there was no way out. The valleys were teeming with shadowy figures, beings neither human nor animal. They writhed and contorted in agony, their forms distorted beyond recognition, reflecting the unimaginable pain of tormented souls. These figures moved in a twisted dance of despair, their bodies stretching and contracting, as though they were trapped in an eternal struggle against something far greater than themselves. Each one seemed to be in a constant state of suffering, bound to a fate they could not escape. Their screams filled the air, deafening in their intensity, each cry a raw manifestation of another layer of suffering and regret. The sound was a cacophony of torment voices that seemed to echo from the deepest corners of their souls, a haunting reminder of the agony that consumed them. These cries were not just noises. They were the very essence of the suffering these beings endured, a constant, relentless wail that reverberated through every part of this terrible place. It was a place of pure anguish, a place where all hope seemed lost, where the very air itself seemed thick with despair. There was no light, no comfort, no promise of relief. The suffering here was infinite, stretching on without end, a torment that consumed every living thing within its reach. It was a place where redemption had no meaning, where all cries for mercy were swallowed by the abyss. The darkness was not just a physical absence of light, it was a suffocating, all-encompassing force that overwhelmed everything. Here, in this horrifying reality, I understood that there was no escape, no redemption, only the endless echo of suffering. As I looked around, my eyes fell upon several prominent rabbis among the suffering. These were men I had long respected, men who had devoted their entire lives to God, men who had dedicated their existence to teaching and interpreting sacred texts, guiding others on the path of righteousness. I had revered them for their wisdom, their faith, and their commitment to the divine law. They were the very pillars of our faith, the ones who had shaped my understanding of what it meant to live a life devoted to God. Yet here they were, trapped, chained, and writhing in agony in the depths of hell. Their faces, once filled with wisdom and reverence, were now twisted in eternal suffering. The sight of them, reduced to this state of torment, shattered everything I had believed about righteousness, about faith, and about what it meant to be in favor with God. These men, who had led others in the pursuit of holiness, now found themselves imprisoned in this place of endless anguish. The shock and devastation that hit me were overwhelming. If these men, who had spent their lives in the service of God, who had taught me how to live according to His will, were here in this place, what did that mean for me? It made me question everything I had ever known about salvation and righteousness. I had always believed that devotion to the law, to the commandments, was the surest path to favor with God. But now, seeing these revered rabbis in this unimaginable state, I was forced to confront a harsh truth. Righteousness was not as simple as I had once thought. There had to be something more, something deeper, something I had failed to understand. The realization left me reeling, lost in a flood of doubt and fear, unsure of where my own path would lead. I was overcome with shock and disbelief. How could this be? These were the very men who had taught me how to interpret the sacred texts, who had shown me the way of God, guiding me through the complexities of faith and Scripture. They were the ones I had trusted to lead me toward righteousness, to show me the path that would bring me closer to the divine. And yet, here they were, trapped in this place of eternal suffering. The sight of their torment, the men I had revered, shattered everything I had once believed about faith, salvation, and divine favor. This was not just a crisis of faith, it was a revelation, one that struck me with such intensity that it shook me to my very core. I had spent my life believing that if I followed the rules, adhered to tradition, and performed the rituals, I would be in favor with God, that I would earn my place in His grace. But seeing these men, these righteous teachers, in such a state of despair made me question everything. It was as if the very foundation of my understanding had been cracked open, revealing a truth I had been blind to for all these years. I realized then that my understanding of righteousness, of salvation, and of the path to God had been incomplete, even flawed. It wasn't enough to simply follow the laws, to rely on tradition and ritual as a way to secure favor with God. There had to be something deeper, something more profound, that I had been missing. These men, revered for their knowledge and piety, were now suffering, and that told me that mere adherence to the rules wasn't the answer. There had to be a deeper connection, a deeper truth that went beyond religious practice and tradition, something I had failed to recognize until now. This realization was both humbling and terrifying. It was as if my entire understanding of faith had been upended, and I was left grasping for the answers to questions I had never thought to ask before. In the deepest, most suffocating depths of this torment, where every breath felt like a battle and every thought seemed weighed down by the crushing gravity of my own failures, I was finally forced to confront the raw and unrelenting truth that I had spent so long running from, ignoring, and desperately trying to suppress. The darkness around me, both external and internal, seemed to close in tighter, and I could no longer escape the painful realization that had been lurking in the recesses of my soul for years. For years, I had believed clung to the misguided notion that the path to salvation, redemption, or inner peace could be achieved solely through the rigid adherence to the old traditions, the practices that had been passed down through generations. I had been taught that these rituals, these laws, were the foundation of my connection to God and my place in His favor. I thought that by following these practices with unquestioning devotion, by maintaining the familiar structure and order of the beliefs I had inherited, I could somehow escape the despair that haunted me. I had convinced myself that salvation was something to be earned, a prize given to those who lived in strict obedience to the rituals, the rules, and the traditions that had always defined my life. I believed that by performing these external actions, by maintaining the outward form of righteousness, I could secure my place in God's grace. I thought that redemption was a reward, something I could achieve by simply following the prescribed way of life, by proving my worth through my actions and adherence to the rules. But now, as I stood in this place of suffering, surrounded by the eternal anguish of those who had once seemed righteous. The weight of my own misconceptions became undeniable. I understood, perhaps for the first time in my life, that salvation, peace, and redemption were not about external actions or blind obedience to tradition. They were about something far deeper, something more profound. It wasn't about fulfilling obligations or performing rituals for the sake of ritual. It was about the heart, the soul, and the true surrender to a higher truth. I had spent my life clinging to the belief that following the traditions would lead me to peace. But now, I saw that the path to salvation was not as simple as I had once thought. It was not about what I had done or failed to do. It was about opening myself to a deeper, more authentic connection to God, one that went beyond rituals and rules, beyond the surface of things. But now, in the crushing depths of my anguish, as every moment felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on my spirit, I was finally forced to reckon with the truth that had been lurking just beyond my awareness for so long, truth that I had avoided, resisted, and denied. The truth that now, in my brokenness, seemed impossible to ignore any longer. Salvation, I came to realize, if it was to be found at all, could not be derived from the mechanical, unquestioning repetition of rituals and traditions simply for tradition's sake. The path to true peace, to the liberation I so desperately sought, was not the simple, linear journey of following rules and customs as though they alone were a ticket to salvation. No, I now understood that such blind adherence to external practices, however sacred or well-intentioned, could never lead to the deep inner transformation I so craved. The path to salvation, I came to understand, was something far more profound, more elusive, and more intimate than I had ever imagined. It wasn't a road defined by the rigid structures of established beliefs, the comforting walls of well-worn rituals, or the security of long-held practices. All of these things, though important, were simply external markers, outward manifestations of something deeper, something I had failed to recognize for so long. What I had failed to understand was that the true journey of peace and healing was not external, it was internal. It was a journey into the very heart of who I was, into the parts of myself I had long ignored, rejected, or hidden away, the dark, uncomfortable, and often painful places I had been too afraid to face. It was a deep and unflinching willingness to confront that darkness within, to grapple with my own fears, doubts, and uncertainties, and to allow that confrontation to transform me. The path to salvation, I now realized, was not about perfect adherence to a set of laws or rituals. It was about a process of inner transformation, a personal awakening to a truth that transcended everything I had believed about faith, salvation, and God. This journey required me to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface, and to face the parts of myself I had been too afraid to acknowledge. I began to see, slowly and painfully, that salvation was not something to be earned through rigid adherence to external practices. It was not a reward for blind obedience or for performing rituals perfectly. Rather, it was the outcome of a profound, personal awakening, a deep and expansive transformation that could only come through a shift in consciousness. This shift wasn't simply intellectual, it was emotional, spiritual, and existential. It required me to let go of old ways of thinking and to release the false security I had clung to in my understanding of God, salvation, and my place in the world. I had to surrender the narrow confines of what I thought I knew and open myself to something far greater, something deeper, something more eternal, something unchanging that transcended my limited understanding. Until that moment, I had been blind to the deeper truth. I spent years searching for peace in things I could control, in structures, rituals, and steps I thought would earn redemption. But in the rawness of my suffering, I finally saw clearly. Salvation wasn't about external conformity. It was about an internal transformation, a connection to something far greater than my individual self, something eternal and unshakable. In that moment of revelation, I realized that my suffering had given me the rare opportunity to awaken to a truth that would change my life. Salvation couldn't be earned through rituals or obedience. It came through a profound shift in how I saw myself and the world. Through an inner awakening, The truth wasn't something to grasp or control. It was something to receive, something that emerged when I surrendered. In that surrender, I knew I had found the path to true healing, peace, and connection with the divine. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith.